The night was heavy, as if the sky itself was mourning something lost, something broken, something ancient that could never be repaired again. And in the silence that followed the storm, there were footsteps, careful, calculating, clinical, not of someone rushing to help or hoping to heal, but someone who had come with a purpose sharp and surgical, like a scalpel, meant to carve, not cure. And in those footsteps came the detective, not with sympathy in his eyes, but suspicion, not with comfort in his voice, but interrogation. He did not come looking for answers. He came hunting for evidence of weakness and failure and cracks. He came for the scent of fear and the weight of regret. He came for the stench of collapse and the taste of surrender. He came because someone somewhere had whispered that here in this house, in this soul, in this body, was something fragile, something finished, something that had finally bent far enough to break. And so he came expecting ruins, and instead, he found fire. You see, what he didn't understand was that warriors don't scream when they bleed. They don't cry out when they're crushed. They bleed in silence. They fall behind closed doors. And when the lights are off and the audience is gone, they get up again. Not because they're unbreakable, but because breaking is part of the ritual, part of the evolution, part of the crucible. And pain is not their punishment. Pain is their proof. And he looked into those eyes expecting to find chaos, but he found clarity, expecting to find a victim, but found a verdict, expecting to find a heart that had given up, but instead found a storm coiled in silence, waiting not to be saved, but to be unleashed. He asked the questions cold, detached, like he was dissecting something already dead, like he thought the story had ended, and he was just here to write the obituary. And he leaned forward, the way men do, when they think they've won, when they believe they're the smartest person in the room. But what he didn't know, what he couldn't know, was that the room was never his. To own the room belonged to the warrior, the one who didn't need applause, the one who didn't need a crown, the one who had burned long before the battle had even begun, and who would still be burning long after the battlefield had been buried under time and dirt and silence. He talked of evidence. He talked of wounds like they were signs of failure. But he didn't understand that wounds don't tell stories of weakness. They tell stories of war, and every scar is a signature of survival, not surrender. Every bruise is a badge earned, not given. And every moment of silence is not shame, but strategy. A warrior is never loud until it's time to strike. And even then, the loudest thing about them is the silence they leave behind when their enemies fall. And he kept digging, hoping to find the moment it all fell apart. But what he found instead was the moment it all came together. The moment the fire turned inward and burned away. The illusion, the excuses, the lies, the comfort, the moment. The warrior stopped running from the storm and became it. The detective had a file full of assumptions and a mind full of patterns and a badge that made him think. Truth bowed to logic, but truth doesn't bleed like that. Truth doesn't walk in straight lines. Truth is born in chaos and raised in fire, and it laughs at rules and it spits on protocol, because truth doesn't care what you expect. Truth becomes what it must to survive. And the truth here was not weak. It was wrath, not broken. It was reborn, not surrender. It was sharpened, and he saw it slowly. The way light creeps over a battlefield, revealing not just who died, but who killed and who kept standing, when the world said they shouldn't, and that's what scared him. Not the story, not the silence, not the shadows, but the realization that what stood before him was not a broken soul crying for help, but a force that had already survived the kind of night most men would not even have the courage to dream of. And so he began to hesitate. He began to realize that he had come with the wrong tools, that this was not a crime scene but a crucible, not a confession booth, but a war chamber. And he wasn't the judge here. He was the guest, and the air around him changed. The temperature dropped, not because the room was cold, but because the warrior had stopped pretending to be human long enough for the storm to surface. And that storm didn't speak in words. It spoke in silence, in presence, in the kind of stillness that only comes when a soul has gone through hell and brought back. Not just stories, but weapons. He tried again to steer the conversation back to logic, back to order, back to the illusion of control. But control was never his to have. The warrior didn't follow scripts. The warrior wrote them with blood and breath and bone. The warrior didn't ask permission. The warrior took ground and never gave it back. And it became clear to him then that the strength here was not in answers, but in endurance. Not in what had been said, but in what had been survived, and that somewhere along the line, the roles had reversed. The hunter had become the hunted. The interrogator had become the intruder. And he, the detective, was not prepared for that truth, because that truth was not neat. That truth was not kind. That truth had claws and scars and rage stitched into its very skin. And yet the warrior did not threaten, did not raise a voice, did not lift a hand, because true power does not need to perform. It simply exists, undeniable, unshaken, unwavering. And the detective suddenly felt small, not because the room was shrinking, but because the illusion of his dominance was dissolving, and in its place stood something ancient, something primal, something forged not in comfort, but in chaos, something that had been made not by love, but by loss, not by peace, but by pain, not by rescue, but by resistance. And that kind of strength doesn't break. It bends and returns, it burns and rises, it falls and resurrects. And by the time the detective realized he had been outmatched, it was too late, because he hadn't just found a warrior, he had awakened one. He sat back now, not with confidence, but caution. And you could see it the way his fingers tapped the table just a little faster than before, the way his eyes darted not from threat to threat, but from memory to mistake, because the mind plays tricks when fear begins to whisper. And in that whisper, he heard the echoes of every time he had assumed too much, every time he had misjudged the quiet ones, every time he thought strength wore medals and not scars. And that's when he began to sweat, not from heat, but from truth, because truth once seen cannot be unseen. And what he saw now was a presence so raw, so real, so unfiltered by expectation, that it rattled the very frame of his identity. And what is identity, if not the stories we tell ourselves to feel in control? And in that room, he had none. The warrior didn't flinch, didn't speak, didn't react in the ways victims are supposed to. And that silence was heavier than any scream could have been, that stillness, more violent than 1,000 fists, because stillness is control, and control is strength, and strength is terrifying when it refuses to bow. And the detective finally understood. This wasn't going to end with a signed confession or a tear-stained explanation, because warriors don't confess, they command. They don't explain, they endure. They don't seek validation, they embody vengeance. And even though vengeance may not have been the purpose, it had become the pulse, and he could feel it like a second heartbeat in the air. So he shifted his questions, tried to pivot, tried to unearth something that would humanize what stood in front of him. But you can't humanize fire. You can't label thunder. You can't analyze a storm, because it exists outside your rules, your metrics, your science. A storm is not a riddle, it is a reckoning. And this was no longer a case, this was a confrontation between illusion and invincibility, between assumption and actuality, between what he thought he'd find and what stood unshaken before him, wearing no armor but truth and no weapon. But history not written in ink but in blood, not stored in pages, but in pain. Not remembered by dates, but by the ache in the bones that refuse to forget. Because the body keeps score when the soul has no more room to cry. And this warrior's body was a monument to every moment. They didn't break every second they chose to rise instead of rot. Every breath taken not because they wanted to live, but because they refused to die. And that refusal is what frightened the detective more than anything else. Not the rage, not the silence, not even the strength, but the refusal. Because it meant this was not about circumstance. It was about choice. And choice is power in its purest form. He tried one last time to reclaim his narrative, to reassert control, to define the situation. But the moment had passed, and the truth had spoken not in words but in presence, in posture, in the calm of someone who had already lived through the worst day of their life and survived. And that kind of survival doesn't scream. It stares, and it stared at him now with a gaze not of hate but of history. And history is heavier than hate, because hate is loud and burns fast. But history, it smolders and sustains it, survives long after the fire has faded. And that's what he felt now. Not heat, but weight. The weight of having judged too soon, the weight of walking into a war zone thinking it was a hospital, the weight of having mistaken silence for submission and stillness, for surrender. And maybe in another world, maybe in another version of the story, he would have apologized, he would have shown respect. But in this world, in this room, he just sat back, nodded slowly and closed the file. Not because the case was closed, but because he had realized it was never his to open to begin with. And when he finally stood to leave, the warrior didn't move, didn't blink, didn't speak, because warriors don't chase approval. They don't need the last word. They are the last word. And when the door shut behind the detective, the silence returned. But it wasn't empty. It was earned. It was the silence of someone who had walked through hell, barefoot with their head held high. It was the silence of someone who had watched everything they loved turn to ash and still stood up to face the wind. It was the silence of someone who had become their own weapon, because no one came, and no one saved, and no one cared, till it was too late. And by then, they didn't need help. They were help. They didn't need heroes. They had become the villain in someone else's story, just to survive their own. And survival is not clean. Survival is not holy. Survival is not poetic. It is violent. It is primal. It is sacred in the way that volcanoes are sacred. And this soul had erupted, not to destroy, but to be born. So let them come. Let them judge. Let them whisper. Let them label. Let them misunderstand. Because warriors don't fight to be understood. They fight because they must. They don't rise for applause. They rise for war. And war is not glamorous. War is not noble. War is not romantic. War is repetition of resilience, a grind of grit, a celebration of scars that never got the luxury of healing. And this warrior had become fluent in that language, fluent in the rhythm of resistance, fluent in the beat of being broken, and still choosing to breathe. And that breath, that one breath, is worth more than all the medals and mercy the world could offer. Because mercy is a luxury, and they had been raised on necessity, trained by trauma, shaped by silence, baptized in betrayal, and crowned by chaos. And in that crucible, they learned that the world doesn't break you. It asks you if you're willing to break yourself for someone else's comfort, and the warrior said no. And that no became a revolution, a refusal to shrink, a rebellion of breath, a kingdom of one ruled by rage and reigned by resolve. So no, there were no tears, not because they weren't felt, but because they had already been cried dry. There was no breakdown, because the breakdown had already happened and been built over with bone and will and war paint. And in that chair in that room, the detective didn't meet a suspect. He met a survivor. And that is a difference too vast for words and too violent for comfort, because survival is not clean. It is earned and earned in silence, in shadow, in solitude, in pain. That doesn't pass but teaches. And the warrior learned. The warrior remembered. And now the world would too. There are truths carved so deeply into the soul. They do not require retelling, only remembering, and the warrior did not need to justify, did not need to validate, because every breath drawn after devastation was its own declaration. Every step taken through shattered memories was its own anthem. Every refusal to fall again was a sermon to gods that no longer listened and devils that had long since grown afraid. And so while the detective left thinking, he had found something strange, something inexplicable. The truth was simpler and darker and older than he could grasp. He had come to find weakness, and he had been unmade by strength that did not beg to be seen, strength that did not need to scream its name, strength that had been buried and bloodied and burned, and still chose to rise, not because it wanted to, but because it was compelled to, because the alternative was extinction, extinction of spirit, of soul, of silence, the kind of extinction that comes, not from death, but from decay, slow, invisible, unnoticed, until one day there is nothing left but a body that moves, and a mind that obeys, and a heart that beats. Only out of habit, and the warrior had come close to that edge, had stared down into that abyss, and felt it stare back, and offer its quiet, empty promises, and still the warrior said no, and that no was not soft. It was seismic, and it shook the chains off one link at a time, until there was only skin, and fire and fight left. And with that, the warrior had remade themselves into something no longer waiting to be saved, no longer asking to be seen, no longer kneeling to the altar of normalcy. Because what the world forgets is that not everyone who bleeds wants to be bandaged. Not everyone who cries is calling for help. Sometimes the tears are part of the ritual. Sometimes the blood is part of the oath. Sometimes the silence is the only scream that matters. And the detective, with all his tools and his training and his tiny little boxes, had no category for what he had just witnessed. He had walked into a story expecting a soft end and walked out carrying a silence that would haunt him forever. Not because it was loud, but because it was final. Final in the way a battlefield is final. Final in the way a storm leaves nothing standing. Final in the way a verdict is final when it is delivered not by courts but by fire and pain and defiance and choice. And so the warrior remained seated long after the door had shut, not because they were waiting, but because they knew waiting was over. The time of explaining was over the time of begging, was over the time of explaining, was over the time of begging, was over the time of hoping for justice from broken systems, and blind men was over, and now only purpose remained. A purpose built not on revenge, but on resolve, not on rage, but on recognition of what they were and what they had become. They were no longer someone who would be asked what happened to them. They were someone who would now be asked how they survived, and that question is far more sacred, far more savage, far more unsettling, because survival doesn't fit into polite conversations and inspirational quotes. It's not pretty. It's not sanitized. It's not a movie montage. It is a daily discipline. It is a constant confrontation with the self, a willingness to return to the site of your own destruction and rebuild brick by broken brick, not to impress, but to exist. And the warrior had done that, not once, not twice, but every single day since the world had turned its back and the storm had called their name. And now they did not seek recognition or pity or praise, because warriors don't need mirrors to know who they are. They carry their reflection in the weight of their walk, in the steadiness of their stare, in the calmness of their chaos. They do not flinch when tested, because they have been tested beyond limits. Most people can't pronounce, and still they breathe not with ease, but with defiance, because every inhale is a rebellion against the grave, and every exhale is a declaration that no matter how many times life comes to burn them, they will rise not untouched, but undefeated. The detective will return to his world. He will file his report. He will drink his coffee and sit in meetings and wonder why some silences keep ringing, and why some faces keep appearing in his dreams. But he will not understand, not fully, because understanding requires living through the fire, and he never did. He only visited, and in that visit he glimpsed something his soul wasn't built to hold. He saw the aftermath of a war and thought he was seeing the beginning of a crime, and that mistake will echo inside him forever, because he had met someone forged in fear and built in battle, and mistaken them for broken when they were in fact reborn. The warrior, meanwhile, will not think of him again, because warriors do not dwell in what others fail to see. They move forward, led not by vengeance, but by vision, not by bitterness, but by the brutal beauty of becoming something no one ever imagined they could. And every step they take from this point forward will be not for forgiveness, but for fire. The kind of fire that doesn't just burn enemies, it warms survivors. The kind of fire that lights the way for others, still crawling through their darkness, unsure if they will ever stand again. And when they see this warrior, they will know. Yes, it is possible. Yes, the storm can be survived. Yes, the soul can be shattered and still sing. Yes, you can be left behind and still become something holy, something feared, something real. And maybe someday another detective will come, another observer, another judge, but this time they won't find someone waiting. They'll find someone watching, someone ready, someone unshaken. Not because life got easier, but because the warrior got louder inside, and that internal roar is all they need to silence the world outside. And when that happens, they won't need to prove anything. They won't need to explain, or justify, or beg, or plead. They will simply be. And in their being, they will remind the world that survival is the most sacred violence of all. So let the record show, not that the warrior was questioned, but that the questions failed to contain them. Not that the warrior was tested, but that the test was found wanting. Not that the warrior was silent, but that their silence was the storm before the strike. And when the strike comes, and it will not be with fury, but with focus, not with chaos, but with clarity, not with noise, but with necessity, because warriors don't fight for attention. They fight because something deep inside them demands it, something ancient, something honest, something that refuses to die, no matter how many times the world tries to bury it. And so this is not the end. This is not the verdict. This is not the chapter closing. This is the pause before the next move, the breath before the leap, the stillness before the explosion. And when it comes, don't look for headlines or heroes. Don't look for medals or monuments. Just look for the shadow, walking through fire, and know that once again they have returned, not for approval, but for purpose. Not to be remembered, but to remind, because sometimes the warrior is not here to fight the world. Sometimes the warrior is the world. And when that happens, all you can do is stand back and understand that what you just witnessed was not pain. It was power, not brokenness, but becoming, not the fall, but the flight. And so the detective came for weakness, but what he found was a truth too terrible to tame a fire, too fierce to frame a presence, too powerful to name. He came for a victim. He left before a warrior, and the world would never forget that silence again. So remember this: the world may come looking for your weakness, expecting your surrender, assuming your silence means defeat. But when they arrive, let them find a storm instead. Let them meet the warrior you became in the fire, because you are not here to explain your scars. You are here to remind them that survival is strength, silence is strategy, and what they mistook for weakness was always the beginning of your war.